Right. So I'm Nathan Hill, a professor in Chinese studies, and this is our next talk in this series that's about Marxism in Asia and Asia in Marxism. And today's speaker is Professor Viren Murthy from the Department of History at University of Wisconsin. He was educated at the University of Chicago and has written, I'll just try and summarize an overview here, written various things about intellectual history broadly, especially in Japan and China. But today he'll be telling us about Marxism in, let's say, in Tamil speaking parts of India. The talk is titled Back to the Future, Reflections on Tamil Marxism, Anti-Colonial Nationalism, and Identity Politics.
I'm going to just share my screen. I put a bunch of different things together, so I might have to skip some of it. I've got about 5 sections and then a conclusion. So first, an introduction, sort of why I'm interested in Tamil Marxism. I mean, what is someone like me who really works on China and Japan, why get into Tamil Marxism? And I'll contextualize a certain debate in Tamil Marxism in relation to a larger question, namely the problem of identity politics. I mean, usually a lot of times identity politics is something that Marxists would criticize, but in, of course, Tamil Marxism, one of the interesting things, a lot of it is about Tamil identity. So how do they bring these two together? And then in this, there's a debate about Mao. So that may be a slight China connection. I had heard that there was going to be a talk about Mao, but now I guess maybe not in the series. But in any case, what I'm talking about now is not, it's not something very esoteric. It's some basic ideas in Mao that there's a debate about, basically the problem of contradiction. Then I go into the politics of tradition and then the Asiatic mode of production. I know you've already had a talk, I think it's by Zhang, who has did something on the Asiatic mode here. Again, we'll revisit that idea. And in that part, maybe we'll also talk a little bit about, certain ways of reading Hegel on Asia. And then 2 sections, one on nationalism and then bringing it together with the kind of traditional, contemporary debate. So why Tamil Marxism? So let me say a little bit about my theoretical interest. And so the title, Back to the Future, is the title of a book that I just finished and should be coming out in the summer, probably by the end of the summer. In this book, I deal with basically Chinese and Japanese, not just Marxism, but politics of time is what I call it. And there, the first chapter deals with value theory and the way in which value theory can turn into a kind of a modernization theory with a twist. I'll talk about this at the end of my presentation. Now, Back to the Future narratives provide an alternative Marxist theory of the past. And in some cases, they could be an example of theorizing from the global South. In some sense, this whole series seems to be about that, because it's about looking at Marxism, but also looking at it from not just from Europe and America, but from a larger perspective, right? And how do we think about that? And there's some people who've called it deprovincializing Marxism, specifically Harry Haratunian, a Japanese historian, who I'll talk about a little more. So this presentation points out the overlap, and this is again going to come at the end, between what I call formal subsumption Marxism. This again will become clear at the end of the talk, and then Tamil identity-oriented Marxism, and showing how they could be both theoretically viable, and both have something like Back to the Future narratives. Now, when I say Back to the Future narratives, what do I mean? I mean those narratives that go back to a past, but they're actually trying to create a different future, and in this context, specifically a socialist future. Now, this is part of a kind of global attempt to unite resistance from the standpoint of race, caste, right? Especially in Tamil Marxism is important, and then class. But at a time when these two movements seem to be separate, right? And this is where we often find, even with the global interest in Black Lives Matter, there was little interest in class when you thought about this. It's something we can also talk about in terms of, what I know not that much about, but what I want to learn more about is something like critical race theory and its limits with respect to class. So the debate forms a central theme of the talk, that is this debate between sort of identity and class, and is relevant more globally, where there are different attempts to think race and Marxism together. So Tamil Marxism brings together these two aspects, right? So that is identity and class, but in relation to these problems of post-colonialism, right? So there are these two aspects of post-colonialism, and one is the critique of anti-colonialism, right, as reproducing capitalist modernity. Now, under this, sometimes they have a critique of Marxism, right? So this is of course, there's a big debate between post-colonialism and Marxism that we could also talk about. But the second part is usually the search for alternatives in existing practices. So, and this might be connected to identity, right, and linking them to revolution. And this we see in formal subsumption Marxism as well. Okay, so we should keep in mind here also now the link between identity politics and identity and the politics of tradition and language, and that's going to become important in Tamil Marxism. So now coming to the recent debate. So we have these two Marxists that I've been just beginning to read, especially the latter. I've been focusing more on the latter. The first I'm using more as a foil. So N. Gunasekaran and N. Muthumohan. So N. Gunasekaran would be something, he's more of the kind of, orthodox Marxist, maybe more on the modernization theory side. And N. Muthumohan is much more about this kind of politics of tradition, emphasizing, identity as a possibility of resistance. And they have a debate that took place around in 2010. Now, if we want to contextualize this debate, we have to realize that language, caste, and nation come together. Now, there's a bit of historical background that I have to cover here, and I'm not going to spend much time on this, but and it's again something that has been written about quite extensively. So first, the problem of identity, right? Often this identity, something like Tamil Marxism, or even a lot of the concepts that are used in these identity politics is given by the oppressor. And here you can think about missionaries such as Robert Caldwell, who wrote a book in 1856 called A Comparative Grammar of the Dravidian or South Indian Family of Languages. So this book separates the Dravidian from the Aryan. Now, this is a big debate. There's an Aryan debate going, and I'm not going to get into that. But what's interesting for our purposes is that after this point, people could start using Dravidian as a kind of category of resistance versus the Aryan. And so this became connected to caste politics, right? The Dravidian becoming, that which is the lower caste, even sort of maybe kind of a politics of equality, an anti-caste kind of movement, an anti-Brahmin movement especially. And this is very evident in the self-respect movement by E.V. Ramasamy, or Periyar, as he's often called, right? And so this becomes, this then lays the groundwork for a lot of Marxists, right? So this opens a space to think about earlier Tamil culture as Dravidian culture, which was socialistic. So there's this idea, and we'll talk a little bit about this as I move on. I'll give a couple of examples. So we'll return to this when we come to the problem of the politics of tradition, or Panpata Arasial. Okay, so both of the Marxists I mentioned, so Gunasekaran and Muthumohan, are connected to the Communist Party of India. Marxists, which was something that split from the Communist Party of India earlier. That's another history that I won't get into. But Muthumohan is perhaps the more eclectic in his Marxism. Now, there are two earlier figures that are worth mentioning just because they're well known. There's Singaravelar, who leaned more towards science. He was in the during the founding of the Communist Party. He was there, and then Jivanandam, who stressed more the politics of tradition. And these are sort of, in some sense, two real pillars of Tamil Marxism. now, so there's the debate really is around the role of the past and nationalism in Marxism, especially the role of the past and identity. So, but we have to understand this contemporary debate in terms of some changes in our recent Indian history. And so here, the movement I want to stress here is the movement from a kind of state-centered capital accumulation to a kind of neoliberal worldview. So basically, the Nehruvian period, which is often thought of as, some people even call it somewhat socialistic. That I think is a mistake, but it was more state-centered, and you had like import substitution, all these kind of things happening at the time, right? And then, but you move from that to a neoliberal period, right? And this is especially the case with Modi, right? But many would say with Morarji Desai, it's already starting. Definitely later, this is a big debate. I mean, this is a debate all over Asia. When did neoliberalism actually start, right? But whatever one says today, we're really in the midst of it in a lot of Asia. With this period, of course, there's a huge shift, right? So from the 80s, you go away from import substitution, right? So this is where you then have, the Coca-Cola was a big thing, right? Because I mean, I left India actually in the 80s, and it was a time when you couldn't actually buy Coca-Cola, right? And that was a big thing, right? And but it was a big thing on both sides. The left was, oh look, the state is really doing something. It's resisting global capital and so on. But by the 90s, slowly all of this started changing, and this, of course, creates a new kind of political opportunities and situation, right? And so you have all these critics of neoliberalism as it's almost like a different form of imperialism. And this is another debate that's big in Indian Marxism, and something we can talk about because it's at the background of Tamil Marxism as well. So this, of course, creates new kinds of inequality, and is also linked to new kinds of new kind of theoretical trends, right? And this is where the critique of post-structuralism comes in. Now, there are these people left behind the development, right? And a lot of people have written about this, right? So you have this idea, the way in which neoliberalism really increases the inequalities and so on that were existing, but is also connected to identity politics. And this is where we come to the content of the debate. So I'm basically looking at a number of essays by Muthumohan, and especially many of them collected in this book called The Politics or Dialectics of Tamil Identity. So, or it should actually be The Dialectics of Tamil Identity Politics, right? So, Arasial in Iyengial. So he draws on the Tamil past to connect it to class-based movements, right? So the anti-colonial, he's thinking about the rekindling the anti-colonial legacy in a neoliberal context. Now, Gunasekaran criticizes him from the standpoint of class, or the more orthodox Marxism, focusing on the economic. Now, this is somewhat different from the value form critique, but they're united in their suspicion of a politics of the past, right? And he wants to contend that the politics of the past is part of this postmodern neoliberalism. So you can't really use that, right? That is going to constantly play into capital is the argument, right? And this is something that, Marxists have made this point against post-colonials and so on, right? So like in my Back to the Future manuscripts, I aim to rescue the politics of the past from the Marxist critique and then reconnect it with the goal of creating a socialist free future. So now let's turn to the politics of the past you sometimes see in Marx, right, or the politics of the remnant. Now, one obvious way is here, right, where he says in Capital, right, alongside the modern evils, we are oppressed by a whole series of inherited evils arising from the passive survival of archaic and outmoded modes of production, with their accompanying train of anachronistic social and political relations. We suffer not only from the living, but from the dead, right? La mort saisit le vif. So this is clearly at this point where it sounds like a very kind of modernization theory point, right? That we've got to get rid of these, we're being oppressed by that as well. So we got to get rid of them as well, right? And it's probably thinking of Germany, right? Now, so this is where earlier extra-economic forms persist. So now in this debate, we now get to Mao, right? About, how do we deal with this extra-economic, right? And Gunasekharan contends that according to Mao, we have to focus on the fundamental contradiction, which is economic, and therefore, and one has to get rid of these earlier forms of domination. Now, that's obviously right, but Mutumoan's response is to really think about the problem of imperialism and unevenness. So he claims that in Mao's essay, the theory of contradiction should not be applied mechanically. There are various types of dialectics at work in contradictions. In an Eastern country, right, or the third world, you could maybe say, right, Kira Natil could also be considered the kind of lower country. So, such as China, when one uses theory, one has to be aware of both the universal and the particular dimension of contradictions. So the problem in Mao, he says, and Mao himself talks about this, right? And he says, for instance, in capitalist society, the two forces in contradiction, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, form the principal contradiction. The other contradictions, such as those between the remnant and the bourgeoisie, are all determined or influenced by this principal contradiction. In a semi-colonial country such as China, the relationship between the principal contradiction and the non-principal contradiction presents a more complicated picture. And this is where he says that at certain times, imperialism could be the main, right? When imperialism launches a war of aggression against the country, then the contradiction between imperialism and that country becomes the major contradiction. And in this case, you could then say, well, the nation form becomes important, right? So that's going to be something we can come back to. So Mutumohan then claims that Mao concretizes ways to create a world beyond economic and non-economic forms of domination. He highlights the importance of extra-economic forms of domination by noting that Mao portrayed society as having complex overlapping contradictions, which made it such that the revolution could not merely rely on the working class. And this is where the other identities have to come in, right? So we see this, many of you will obviously think of Althusser here, and Mutumohan's also thinking of this, and with the concept of overdetermination in Eastern society. So overdetermination implies numerous forms of production, which we see in various terms that Mao uses, such as interpermeation and so on, right? Which is this different modes of production articulated with one another, right? And so this again brings us to the problem of multiple modes, which we'll come to in a second. So, but overdetermination is not the same everywhere, even if it exists everywhere. So I think the big question here is what unevenness has to do with this, right? How does unevenness, what is the role of unevenness here? So let's summarize what we've done so far. So we now have two different Marxist interpretations of identity politics, right? One, an interpretation of identity politics as postmodern and emerging after the defeat of class politics, right? So that's the critique of neoliberalism and identity politics go together. But then there's the idea Mutumohan wants to put forward, and that is the idea of an identity politics out of the overdetermined relations of colonial capitalist imperialism. So that is where, identity politics, before it was called identity politics, was existing in anti-colonial struggles, right? That's the point. Okay, so now let's examine the second form of identity politics in greater detail, right? And this is where we get to the politics of tradition and the Asiatic mode of production. So in colonial capitalist Indian society, it is a fact that inherited foundations changed, right? So this is where everything is reconstituted. However, the Asiatic mode of production, which has survived for a long time, reveals itself by influencing identity politics. So this is a very interesting part of the book, unusual. When I first read it, I thought it was kind of strange, but he brings in the Asiatic mode of production. But then as I read it, I began to think, well, what's he doing with the Asiatic mode of production? And it's really the Asiatic mode of production is really representing kind of inherited forms of community. So he says, first we could say both Hegel and Marx use the concept of the Orient to show a path different from the West, and that I think is the possibility here. Now, since we have different ways of tackling the concept I'm thinking of the Asiatic mode of production, just as with the remnant. So the usual mode is negative. The Asiatic mode of production is outmoded. It's anti-freedom. Or the concept itself has to be disregarded, right? And that discarded. And that's Perry Anderson in his book, Lineages of the State, of the Absolutist State, I think. So recently, so people have problematized this view, Deleuze and Guattari, sorry, I don't have the Guattari there, but I think it's in Thousand Plateaus or Anti-Oedipus, one of those, they try to, reuse the concept in a different way. And Mutumoan is sort of similar to this, except he's trying to look at the possibilities of the Asiatic mode almost becomes something potentially positive. And if we look at Marx himself on this, there are things we see that we look at it from a different perspective, it's sort of nice, right? I mean, there's cooperation in the labor process, if we find it in the beginning of human civilization among hunting peoples. A predominant feature of the agriculture of Indian communities is based on the one hand of common ownership of the conditions of production, and on the other hand, the fact that those cases, the individual has little torn himself free from the umbilical cord of his tribe or community as a bee from his hive, right? So both these characteristics distinguish this form of cooperation from capitalist cooperation. Now, what's interesting here, and this is, what's here is that there is something communal about this, right? But common ownership of the mode of production, that sounds like conditions of that could be socialism as well. So there's a way in which what has to happen is this has to be sublated into something else, right? So if it's sublated and if these things are already there, then well, that could be something positive. So this is where part of the past could turn into the future. So Mutumoan connects this idea of the communal remnants to Marx's famous letters about Vero Zaslich, and I was talking to Nathan about this in the beginning. It's worth citing a little bit. And so this is where he's talking about these archaic types of communal property. And he says, we shouldn't be afraid of these. We could actually be drawing on them, especially given that we are in a global capitalist world at this point. Now, Harry Hartunian, who I mentioned here in his book After Marx, also talks about this. And he says that this is, these are possibilities for a new kind of historical community, right? And that I think is, this is where you have use value and non-differentiation of subject and object still prevailed, bringing with it possibilities for a different form of political community. So this, I think, is very much, and this is someone who's, I would call him a formal subsumption Marxist. So we'll come back to him later. So now let's think about this in the Tamil context. So Mutumoan claims that we need to build on the legacy of previous Tamil activists who themselves revived and reinterpreted classical Tamil literature and philosophy to reimagine socialism. So some of these I'm not going to talk much about, but these are people I'm interested in learning more about myself. I mean, one is there's a Buddhist revival at this period by someone named Ayoti Das. And he's written a lot about Buddhist politics, but again, Buddhist politics connecting it somehow to socialism, and that is by, sort of, you would call this kind of utopian socialism, but we have to sort of sublate this rather than negate it. So Jivanandam, who I already mentioned, already began this project, and Mutumoan sort of continuing this, right? Finding alternative narratives of socialism that highlight both the lower castes and the problem of class. Now, Buddhism is important from the standpoint of caste because it goes against the Hindu kind of ideal. And this is where Ambedkar would be important here, right? And Ambedkar and Das both sort of connect Buddhism to both the working people and the peasants. Now, in the Tamil tradition, you'll often find, and here again, there's a lot of work to be done, and I've only sort of scratched the surface, but there are examples of how to, what are some of the sources that he's looking at to try to develop socialist ideas. And a lot of people go back to Tirukural, right? It's a text by Tiruvallavar, and it was written compiled around the 3rd century BC to the 5th century CE. Now, the passages in Tirukural that Mutumoan highlights are the following. So one is, the feeling of I and mine are nothing but vanity and pride. He who crusheth them entered the world higher than that of the gods. So this idea of self-negation, he wants to connect to a kind of communal idea, right? So points to a communal form of identity, but it might appear that we're sacrificing subjectivity here. So it's like, and this was of course Hegel's critique of the Orient. But Hegel also writes positively about this kind of unity beyond the self. And this is where, we can go back to the Hegel problem that I think Statman was talking about. So here, Chatterjee, Partha Chatterjee draws on Hegel in a very similar way to Muthumohan's drawing on Marx's Asiatic mode of production, to sort of flip it and say that, if you look at the family substantiality, you have this whole discussion of love, which is all about the unity of one consciousness with another, the overcoming of self-consciousness, right? It's not just my self-consciousness, but the renunciation of my independent existence with another and the other with me. So I'm not going to read this. This is a very nice passage, but I'm not going to read the whole thing because I think I'm probably taking a little too much time here. But the point here that Chatterjee tries to do is to try to flip this and say again here, wait a second, we've got here a kind of socialist potential here, even though Hegel is going to say the problem is that it negates the individual, and we'll come to that in a minute. So the point here is that is both in the family, and that's a description of love, and the Asiatic mode of production, we have the substantiality of community that in some sense could be something that we could draw on. The problem that Hegel sees here, of course, is the destruction of subjectivity, or the lack of subjectivity, right? And this is where Muthumohan, here's the he here, cites C.L.R. James to sort of, again, citing Hegel, which is where he says the ultimate truth is not just substance, but also subject, right? So we have to think about the idea of truth, and this is Hegel in the Phenomenology. So C.L.R. citing Hegel, so I'm citing Muthumohan, citing C.L.R. James, citing Hegel. But in any case, the point here is Muthumohan is trying to break out of a linear narrative where the self-interest of civil society and capitalist colonialism are necessary before one can get to unite substance and subject. And so he finds this unity even in earlier texts, and this is where we have come to Tirukural again. And this is the same text, but the saying number 972, where he says the manner of birth is the same for all human beings, but their reputations vary because they differ in the lives they lead. And here I think the real interesting point is this se toril vetrumayan, which is really toril is actually a term for work, so you could translate it that way, in which the work they do, and that's their subjective input, really puts it differently. But you can then see how this could be mobilized against caste, right? Because in the birth they're all the same, right? And yet, it's the work that they do that changes things, right? And so this is one way of thinking about substance and subject together. Now, this is a kind of textual critique, but their argument is that you also have practices that develop these critiques. So now we've shown how the politics of the Asiatic mode of production, the politics of the remnant, and the politics of tradition come together. What these have in common is the use of earlier forms of community against capitalism, and we see this in the Zasulich letter. Now, in the modern period, especially in the context of empire and imperialism, the form that this takes is the nation. And so now we come to the next section, which is the politics of tradition and nationalism. Now, in this, we often have, the question of whether the nation form is going to exist and so on. But I think the real question here in relation to identity politics is the question of how one understands anti-colonial nationalism, right? So a new manner of uniting substance and subject sort of brings us to the problem of anti-colonial nationalism. So after all, part of the task of finding socialism in Tamil classics concerns the construction of a Tamil national identity, but this is not necessarily the construction of a Tamil national state, right? And so that means that this idea of the nation is connected to a larger idea of Indian socialism, right? and eventually, of course, world socialism. So here at the sub-state level, Tamil Marxism, such as Muthumohan, are creating a national identity. So he then compares this to the conception, to Otto Bauer. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Otto Bauer here, because I think he's sort of relevant in his, because he also separates the nation and the state. So if you think of Bauer and Tamil nationalism, Bauer actually talks about caste, but he's much more, the part that he's probably more interested in is Jewish identity. But that gets us into another interesting topic, but one perhaps for another day. So first, some Marxists had the idea that the nation would become less important as time progressed, while Austro-Marxists such as Bauer believed that nations would continue. Now, moreover, and so this brings up the whole issue of nations and capitalism, which is another issue that we might want to get into. So moreover, Muthumohan focuses on Bauer because he believes that there's an important distinction between Central and Eastern Europe as opposed to Western Europe. And Bauer is thinking a lot about Central and Eastern Europe, right? So Central and Eastern Europe are sort of, in his opinion, I think an interesting idea that's more similar to the oppressed nations of the world. So you can sort of separate and stop thinking of Europe as one unity, right? Okay, so in Central Europe, Bauer is thinking of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which consisted of numerous nations, right, including Hungary and so on, right? And so the question here again, so the relation to the Indian context is sort of interesting, right? So for this reason, Bauer did not consider language as the basis of the nation, which might seem to go against one of the premises of Tamil Marxism. But we should not forget that, as we've seen, for example, in readings of Tirukural, Tamil is actually a culture, right, rather than just, so that's why Panpada Arasial is really cultural politics or politics of tradition. So moreover, since Bauer was thinking within an empire, he separated nation from state. So let's look at a couple of sections from Bauer. So here, the first citation really from Bauer really talks about a national community of culture, right, achieving self-determination, right? And that's within, so this is all within a state, right? So they're going to have, so this is where you get sort of identity and difference. So again, he's also talking about the thinking of the nation as cultural rather than territorial, again, separating it from the state. And this, he thinks, is going against his kind of imperialism, right? Because imperialism might be, much more of a territorial principle. So this is where you get a different principle where you kind of, you have the personality principle and so on. And he's interested in kind of the minority groups, right? And that again is something that I think Muthumohan sees as important for the Tamil position. Okay, so now this type of cultural definition of the nation is, of course, could be ideal in multinational states such as India, where you have all these problems of diversity. And the question, of course, is how do we think of a socialism that is able to, respect that diversity. So the Marxist dimension of Tamil Marxism lies in drawing on so-called backward regions to confront capitalism and formulate a narrative of community. Now, in the midst of the discussion of Bauer, Muthumohan argues that the nation draws on earlier communal structures, and it plays on these terms, inakuru, which is like an ethnic community, or which is a tribe, and Inam, which is ethnic community. And here again, he brings back Zasulich, right? So that you can then have, various versions of Zasulich going on in one, and that then somehow connect. So now, summary of this section before moving on to the final section. So the politics of Muthumohan's nationalism is complex because it thinks within the context of empire, but also in terms of community. Now, anti-colonial nationalism has to be different from imperialist nationalism. And this is, again, an old post-colonial problematic, right? This was back to Chatterjee. All of those people were sort of critical of anti-colonial nationalism because it reproduced the structures of domination. So let's examine now how this problematic resonates with contemporary debates in Marxism. And this is where I'll slowly come to value theory. So Tamil Marxism and recent debates around Marxism. So much of what Muthumohan is saying might seem counterintuitive when seen from the standpoint of certain dominant strands of contemporary Marxist theory. So there's been a trend in the past few years to stress the global dimension of capitalism and consequently pay less attention to unevenness, especially insofar as unevenness appears as an alternative, or the roots of an alternative. So from this perspective, focus on earlier forms of community to confront capitalism is considered reactionary or potentially fascist. So incidentally, when I mentioned Singaravela and Jivanandam, the Singaravela was a little concerned about Tamil identity because he's writing in the 30s and 40s, thought it could lead to fascism. But I think it could, but I don't think that is a necessary development. So in other words, if such works identify unevenness, they don't highlight the possibility that this has a possibility of resistance, and this is what I'm thinking of the mainstream kind of Marxists. So recent works, there's a lot of works that stress this kind of global capitalism, and this is often connected. And now we can talk about how the value form fits in here. Now, my own earlier work on Zhang Taiyan actually follows this kind of very much value theory focusing on Moishe Postone, who would be one of the people who really stresses value theory. And I'm still somewhat indebted to his work, but I'm also a little concerned. I have my concerns. So Andy Liu is a recent book on South Asia, both South Asia and East Asia, one of the few books that, and offers a very interesting economic history of these two places, but it's very much grounded in this kind of value theory. And he says that basically the suggestions offered in this book is that the conditions of the possibility of abstract human labor premised theories of value turned upon specific limitations and determinative social practice, whether living in Glasgow or Shanghai. So he wants to get, and he's writing in the early 20th, late 19th century, I think. And so you got looking at this kind of a total global picture that, again, where unevenness ceases to be that important. And so is imperialism is not that important either. So this is a tendency to reorient capitalism away from specific class relations to abstraction in a specific theory of value. Right, so you don't really have to, you can have all kinds of forms of labor, but you still have abstract domination. So the side effects of all of this is the revolutions basically were all capitalist. I mean, there's not a real big, the whole socialist movement of the 20th century is now subsumed under productivity or capitalism, right? So that and this is what's great, interesting about this book is it's actually very, in some ways, it's trying to argue for the global South, saying, hey, wait a second, they're not marginal. They're also capitalists. They're great. So everybody can be happy and be capitalist, right? And it's a weird place that Marxism has got itself into. So it's basically saying, in the most productive years, the gains the gains of like agriculture really grew, right, is what he wants to say after the Great Leap Forward. So this trend in revisionist histories of the revolution, which rescue them by showing them how well they accomplished capitalist goals. In effect, what I say is they take the revolution out of revolution. Now, it's not surprising that this global position has been very easily appropriated by non-Marxist works. And take this example, like global Fordism, right, which looks at Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and it also looks at compares it to the US. And so if you think about this, what it does is it says, well, yeah, I mean, okay, so you've got Soviet Russia, what it's being socialist ceases to matter anymore. So while these books are laudable in bringing global capitalism into the picture, they write as if the socialist movements and imperialism are unimportant. One of the important points in this narrative is not only the downplaying of third world Marxism, but also the whole 20th century socialist experience. And I think these two are connected. Third world Marxism, of course, is in some sense, I mean, it's an alternative to like Soviet socialism, but definitely Chinese socialism was a big inspiration there. So against this emphasis on capitalism, which turns the world into a night in which all cows are capitalist, some Marxists have stressed formal subsumption. And here there's a lot of discussion, and so now I'll get into what we mean by formal subsumption Marxism. So there's been a trend against the homogenizing vision of capitalism, thus making a space for us to rethink movements such as Tamil Marxism. Some scholars are promoting this term and draw creatively on Marxist concepts of real and formal subsumption. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but basically, because Marx says something very specific about real and formal subsumption, and I think the theorists who use this, and two I'll mention here, Massimiliano Tomba and Harry Haroutunian, they're actually using it in a more broad sense. So the specific meaning of it is that, so formal subsumption is when capitalism first begins, it often makes use of earlier forms of production, right? And it says without changing the character of the actual labor process, and the actual mode of working, right? But then eventually you then get to, in one narrative, right? You then revolutionize the actual mode of labor, right? And the real nature of the labor process as a whole. So that's real subsumption, right? So that's the very specific idea. But I think what's happening with formal subsumption is that we're now beginning to talk about it more as things that cannot be completely subsumed by capital. So the formal subsumption, so many of the formal subsumptional theorists, as I mentioned, Massimiliano Tomba and Harry Haroutunian, they use the term formal subsumption not merely to discuss labor, although that's part of it, because the Vara-Zasilic ideas, again, could be considered a formal subsumption, right? But to speak about practices and experiences that are not subsumed by capitalism, right? And this is where it intersects with Chakrabarty's history 2, right? Where you have, history 1 being the history of capital, where everything leads to capital, but then history 2 being these kind of experiences that cannot be completely subsumed, right? And these are all themes, I think, in Tamil Marxism. So I've already suggested how such experiences might be part of a socialist project, so I'm not going to talk about that more. So let me summarize here. So through referring to formal subsumption, we might see the possibility of constructing different paths out of capitalism by drawing on earlier forms of community. These earlier forms of community might be embedded in texts, traditions, and practices. So there are different kind of ways of thinking about this. To some extent, the right wing is already sort of doing this. I mean, you find many more narratives of community on the right than you do on the left. Right? And so now I'll conclude. So this new version of reading formal subsumption returns us to what we call Back to the Future narratives, right? Which I see in Muthamalan's Marxism. Tamil Marxism suggests that we might need to rethink empire and nation in relation to socialism. That was the Otto Bauer moment. But the Back to the Future narrative, and now I talked about the limits to this presentation, is only the first step in a larger socialist vision, which again has to be informed by a theory of struggle towards a post-capitalist society. But that is a larger question that goes beyond the scope of this talk. And I'll stop there and look forward to your comments.
In my experience as a consumer of books about Marxism, there's a tendency that people are either kind of theory heavy or historical, and I really feel like this paper had a lot of theory and a lot of history very beautifully intertwined. To some extent, ethnicity, language, class, and caste are all orthogonal. Yeah, you have Brahmins who speak Tamil who have very dark skin. Yeah. So I'm just curious about like this interest in seeing kind of Dravidians as non-Brahmanical, which of course has a certain historical truth to it. There's no doubt, but yeah, like how does the sort of question of Tamil speaking Brahmins fit into this for, I don't know, either for like Tamil speaking Brahmins or for Tamil speaking Marxist theorists?
Yeah. Well, that's good. I mean, I think that's a great question, and one that is definitely very close to my heart, because I mean, my mother was a Tamil speaking Brahmin. So So, and when I go to India, I'm often around Tamil-speaking Brahmins, and then most of them are not. I don't know if Tamil makes them any more Marxist, but I think the question, I think it goes to the heart of the whole movement, because what you end up having is a question of what kind of Tamil are you talking about, right? And they start this was something that I didn't get into in the talk, but they began to rethink the language, right? And since you're a Sanskrit scholar, I mean, it really shows, I mean, in the use of the attempt to avoid Sanskrit, right? Because the whole point of they're saying, well, what is the difference between Brahmin Tamil? And well, first of all, the Brahmins, they have a bit of a dialect, right? So that's one thing that automatically, in fact, I didn't know this because I actually started studying Tamil only, maybe a couple of years ago when I started thinking about this project. And then it's when I realized that, all the Tamil that I'd heard when I was younger is Brahmin Tamil. It's not pure Tamil. And the most obvious example is in some of the verb conjugations, right? Panindirka, right? The minute you say that, they know, are you Brahmin? And the thing is, so you avoid all of that, and you use indigenous Tamil words, and that. But of course, there are obviously Brahmins because if you study classical Tamil literature, well, that's the kind of Tamil you're going to get. Now, this caused all kinds of problems, right? Because the people who are going to do that and learn all of that are not going to be the masses. So this is where then Jivanandam had to rethink a lot of this and go back to folk, and so it becomes a really complex question that you begin to have to, really go to a lot of these. You have to go to folk traditions and so on, and in some sense, this is something that. I think there are parallels to the Chinese traditions, right? Because like the Chinese Revolution have to keep going. They've got this language. Okay, we've got plain speech, but then it's a language that the masses are not really that familiar with, and then they have to go back and rethink it, right? And go to the countrysides and collect songs and so on. And I think there's some of that going on as in this context as well. But yeah, it's a large question. Yeah.
Well, maybe this transitions kind of smoothly into another question I have, which is sort of so I won't be able to get this guy's name right.
Muthumohan.
Muthumohan. I mean, he sounds like, first of all, just a great Marxist theorist, and makes me wish I could read Tamil.
Maybe we should get him translate.
Well, let's say I think there's a danger with which is sort of related to what we were just talking about with, let's call it, high Marxist theory, which is you go into a sort of factory and you say like, well, Kautsky says this and Rosa Luxemburg says this, and so I wonder what like does he have any kind of concrete revolutionary political vision of like, so in right here in India right now we should fight Modi and neoliberalism by doing X?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something I'd have to look into a little more. I mean, because they all have connections to the Communist Party, and so that could be, but this is the big problem with Marxism, is that we are so out of the mainstream that when you look at concrete political practices, it becomes almost banal sometimes. I mean, like as you said, I mean, we have to fight Modi, we've got to fight, the Hindu right, but all that, of course, you can connect it to cultural politics, right? And we have to, go against the Brahmin elite, because who are pro Modi, even though Modi is not a Brahmin, but that, so there's that. It becomes something that maybe most left liberals would probably also agree to. So I think that the big question is going to be, well, how do we get from there to something further, right? How do we get from that? How do we link that to a larger movement? And this is where maybe class is going to come in.
Maybe the best we can do, anywhere now is, and you touched on this, is kind of finding ways of articulating senses of belonging that are not overtly on the right. Yeah.
Exactly.
And that you know, that I mean, it's, I actually would say that like the Hindutva movement, you know, saying, you know, global capitalism is right there in the Rig Veda is a remarkable political, if not intellectual, achievement.
You know, and that's where I think these guys are going, oh no, but socialism's there, you know.
Yeah.
And I sort of like that. And I think, I think that is the real issue, that I think that, you know, we've come to a place where, you know, and I think that the Modi is really interesting because there's a nationalism there. And I think that what's happened, I think, is that the left has had and the Marxists have had a much more difficult time dealing with nationalism. And I think that's that especially happens when we stress global capitalism, right? That we end up saying, and I think post-colonialism has done a bit of damage on this too, even though, you know, because they are so much about deconstructing the nation too, right? So that we've deconstructed the nation so much that it becomes much easier for the right to just have a monopoly on the nation form. And I think that is something that, you know, I think the left has only recently begun to realize that, right? That it really needs, you know, I think in Indian Marxist circles, I think the problem of caste was also neglected. And that, I think, is again a reason why Tamil Marxism is, you know, has a slightly better track record, perhaps because of the whole history of Periyar and that movement. There was a little more of consciousness. And I think, you know, and we should also note that the South, definitely Tamil Nadu and Kerala, have always been a little more resistant to Modi, right? And the BJP. I mean, there's actually elections going on in Coimbatore right now. So, you know, and they're trying to mobilize against, you know, keep the DMK, I mean, which is against both, you know, Congress and the BJP.
I'll throw a very specific question at you, which is when you're talking about value form analysis, to me that makes me think immediately of Michael Heinrichs and the kind of Neue Marx Lectura. Like, am I right?
Michael Heinrich is one of them. I think, yeah, Michael Heinrich for sure. You know, there's the Neue Marx Lectura, and you know, Postone is the one I know best because I was very influenced. I am very influenced by his work. It's not in this, but I mean, I think, and if I were to continue and say, you know, where do we go from here? What does any politics of tradition have to deal with? And keep in mind, it's going to be some of the things he was talking about, like the changing composition of capital and those kind of things, right? But you're right. I think that but there are many issues connected to value theory Marxism. I mean, it's really the focus on the value form and those first 3 chapters of Capital. And the question, I think a lot of questions is, how do we understand those? I think, how do we think of those in terms of the larger society? Are those, you know, kind of social forms that unproblematically become global, right? So that my question is, when we talk about global capitalism, we also have to think about how it globalizes.
It sounds like for you, or maybe the issue is in, you know, when we move from concrete labor to abstract labor, what is the actual sort of, what is the actual social practice that implements that abstraction, and how global is that? A very sort of rough and ready critique of the CCP in the 1950s is they were like, well, you know, like, as long as we believe, you know, strongly enough, we don't actually have to worry about, you know, what agricultural outputs really are. So I think there's on the one hand, I think everyone thinks there's some sort of fundamental material determination of societies, But on the other hand, it seems like you're saying it's very easy for even Marxists in thinking about value theory to universalize and dehistoricize the categories of capitalist abstraction.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think, and you mentioned Mikhail Heinrich, and because Mikhail Heinrich, I would think of the people I've read, and I can't say I've read all of them. He's one of the most careful, and I think that's because there are a lot of conflations that I think some of the others make that he doesn't. And so the first one is the relationship between capitalism and market. So that if you think about Postone, one of the things he wants to say is that there is no, that you can have capitalism without a market. And that then allows you to talk about state capitalism. Right, and so and this is the reason why, because the value form is something that can operate without the market, right? So that is the point that he wants to make. Now Heinrich doesn't go there, right? So Heinrich steps back from making that. So that's one thing, is just the relationship, between like market and capitalism, and but when you make that distinction, well, then you get into another issue, which is what is the status of those first 3 chapters of Capital, right? When Marx is talking about exchange, right, and things like that, and he says that you don't have the category of wage labor yet. So then the question is, how do we, are those, this is, I'm influenced by a French Marxist named Jacques Bidet, who has a very interesting theory that the first 3 chapters in some sense are talking about the market, but without capitalism yet, and then you have a chapter that is about the transformation of money into capital, and then you get capital. But then that makes a very interesting shift between these two, and then there's a political moment, which is about the boundaries of capital, right? And there's a political problem there, and that gets us to the nation and the state. And I think the real problem is a very old problem in Marxism, and that is, how do you theorize the state? Since Ralph Miliband and Poulan Saz, we've been talking about that, and I think what's very interesting about value theory Marxism is that it's able to, it almost, in many cases, and here again Heinrich, I've got an essay on the state and stuff, which is okay, which again sees the problem, but I think often the value form almost tries to trump the state and say, well, the state is also an expression, because bureaucracy is also an expression of the value form. And then I think then we're in some trouble, I think. So that's one thing. The other problem is the globalization of capital, again, is connected to the state, because that's how you can theorize imperialism, right? While often the value theory Marxists will say, well, no, that imperialism is not that important, because it's a secondary kind of thing, right? The real thing is capitalism. I think the real issue, as I was trying to present it, is really a question of, how can we draw on identity politics for Marxism, and I think that's really an important issue for us, because so much of the liberal left, and in some sense the right, are all connected with identity politics. Because if you think about Modi, there's a kind of identity politics with him too. It's a Hindu identity, and it's a Hindu identity politics that's sort of connected to a kind of neoliberal project. And what's so great about that as an ideology is that it can get different people, right? You can have people who are my relatives in India who will support Modi because of the economic stuff, right? And all that, anti-Muslim, that's not really serious. It's just, he's really about developing the economy, right? But then you can also have those who are sort of anti-imperialist, who can also support Modi. And this is what's really mind-boggling, because he's so pro-American in some ways. We'll have to see what he does with the Russian issue. There are a lot of people who are, sort of pro sort of Indian identity and maybe a bit anti-West, who also can support Modi. So he's able to grasp these two, right? These two sides. More broadly, I guess, we can, if we think about the way people are rallying around race and so on like that and things like that, the question for Marxism is, can we then, connect that to a larger kind of movement that has a vision that goes beyond just affirming identity, so that somehow affirming identity has to be connected to something broader. And so that's where you're going to have to really rethink what identity means, right?
There was a little discussion in the papers after the publication of Volume 3, where basically, various people, most famously Bamvarek, were sort of waiting to say like, this is just all nonsense. And now that Volume 3 is out, we can tell, and a lot of that centered around this this transition. I don't remember exactly where it happens in Capital, but where he's like, okay, we have the whole thing with it's so funny actually, the weaver who sells, buys the Bible and
exactly.
And like you said, there's no wage labor in that whole discussion. So I think it's clear that Engels thought, and one of the positive reviewers thought, that at least this is just a sort of a kind of methodological progression where we're introducing different determinations. And so we say, okay, well, here's the commodity, and his description of the commodity comes straight out of Adam Smith, right? And then and then you have each of these sort of turns of the screw, right? And the interesting thing actually is that in simple commodity exchange, then at least in theory, commodities will sell at their labor values,
right?
And so it's actually the introduction of the movement of capital investments across sectors is what throws things off of their labor values. So it's actually linked to the transformation problem. And then this reviewer had said, okay, this is great theory, but it's just an analytical device. But then Engels wanted to say, no, like historically speaking, like commodity markets were free and labor markets were free before capital markets were free. So this is not a theoretical thing. It's actual historical process, and has a discussion about like which societies he thinks had like where in history, in terms of time and space, can we actually find simple commodity
so that is a big debate, and I think a lot of people were sort of critical of that, of it being historical, and I think that's how value theory came, because the thing about the value theory reading that's sort of interesting is that it's very Hegelian, and for that I should sort of like it, but I think Bidet has a point when he says, one of the things, like you mentioned with the weaver and so on, if you look at that first chapter, a lot of it is it's artisanal labor. Right? It's people coming in. It's almost, if you think about it, it's like, I was just reading some work by a guy named, he's a Renaissance historian named Michael Martocchio. And it's all about markets in the 12th century in Italy. And Bidet draws on this as well. But there you see, you have markets, but it's not capitalist markets. They're like, there's another logic that's working there. And it almost seems like he's getting that. I mean, it's not quite being historical, although there could be historical places where there's something close to that. But of course, once you get into the history, then you've got to get into a lot of the externalities that are there. Like there's maybe an idea of honor that's influencing the value. And interestingly, and this I only know from Martocchio's work, and that is that, they were actually selling places. You could actually sell sovereignty, right? But that's also relevant, because by the time you get to the third, fourth, fifth chapters, you begin to already get an enclosed space where capitalism is taking place, right? So that you begin to get the boundaries of capital and laws, right, and things like that come in, and a lot of Marx's work is really happening in that abstraction, right?
Well, I mean, he was quite explicit about this methodologically. He says, I'm assuming away all foreign countries, so I don't think that's
no, that's not a problem. I mean, it's something that comes up at the end, right, when you get the various primitive accumulation. And I think the other point that you made with the transformation problem is also important, right, because there is the idea that things are selling at their value, and that's a big issue, because value is socially necessary labor time, right, and that's a difficult idea to think about in real life. And I remember when I was writing my dissertation, so the first book was really was something that my advisor came, I was in my advisor's office. He didn't like all this value theory, and he goes, but how do you explain the price of a Chateau Lafite?
Oh, that's a monopoly price. That doesn't have to be covered by value theory. But
yeah. And then he goes, what about my daughter wants a Gucci bag?
There
are all these things. And so the problem is that it's so value and price, and because you go to the economics department and they're only interested in price.
They
don't price and value are the same for them, right? And so then you've got to sort of explain that no, what he's not interested in sort of predicting prices, but he's trying to get at a logic of society, right?
Yeah, and I think not interested is exactly the right way of putting it. Because this is what, like, when I run into people and they're like, what, you're reading Marxist economics? Well, it's all wrong because it can't predict prices. It's like, you don't become a Marxist to play the stock market, So getting back to what you were saying, it sounds like that the strong implication of Marxist presentation is that capitalism is a form of, is a mode of production among many that are compatible with the market. And that the implication then is, if you don't have a market, that's not capitalism. And so that's what I always, when I read this kind of state capitalist literature, I always think, why don't we just call this a different mode of production? I mean, maybe it's a small point, but
no, that's an important point, because when you call it capitalist, you seem to be legitimating it. See, that's the weird thing about our world today, that like Andy Liu's book, I mean, it's pro-China, right? And this was the thing, because this was one of the things that was very interesting when I brought Moïse Poston to China, right? And we had a discussion with a lot of Chinese leftists, right? And he was talking about his theory of value, the value form, and all that stuff, and global capitalism and all of that, and he talked about China, and he was trying to praise China. And he says, Mao made a great contribution to China by being such a good capitalist, and they're furious, right? And he can't understand. He's like, no, I'm praising Mao, and that is it's a lot of it has to do with that whole idea of state capitalism.
Now I'm really in an area I don't know anything about, but I think that's kind of close to the reigning ideology, right? Is that, like, Zhang realized that we needed to release the potential of the forces of production, and that means a little more primitive accumulation. Thank you very much. And and everything will be fine in 2050 when we actually move, when we've had enough capitalism to move to socialism, right? So I think that would sort of imply that, to the extent that Maoism was a success, I think Zhang and Xi would agree with Poston then, that's my...
sort of. In some ways they would, I think, and unlike the orthodox Maoist who wants to say that there was something else in Mao. And so this, the narrative of the Cultural Revolution, right, that says, you want it. And that I think, that narrative, I think, is sort of, India is interesting to bring into this, because India sort of goes in two different ways. There's some, branch. I think now the CPIM is really pro-China, I think even, more, because so then they end up having to say that China even today is sort of socialist, right? Or at least not capitalist, something along those lines. So they're going, and I think that, the Maoist party, there's a communist party that leans towards Mao, right? And they would be much more, that no, they're very anti-contemporary China, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that kind of thing is still, so the new left is in China is a difficult kind of beast, because they're somewhat, when it comes to China-America relations, they're very pro-China, but they're also pro-Mao in a way that, they want to keep that as a vantage point to criticize the present. And I think that what Postone was doing is sort of almost taking the rug out from under them, right?
Yeah, I see that. Yeah.
Because I think that that's really, this whole idea of, whether the Soviet Union and China and communist China were both capitalist. I mean, that really takes away the whole 20th century socialist movements, right? Because then with that, all third world Marxisms go, right? Because they're all just state-centered modes of capitalist accumulation, right? That didn't understand the value form.